In the first week of December 2001, a pharmacist named Graciela ran a small shop in Cordoba, Argentina. She had savings, real savings, 11 years of careful accumulation sitting in a dollar account at a local bank. When she walked in on Monday morning to make a routine withdrawal, the teller told her the account was frozen. Not closed, not empty. Frozen. The money existed. She just could not touch it. What followed was something she described years later in a Buenos Aires newspaper interview as watching your life through a window you cannot open. She could see her savings on the bank statement. She could not use them to pay her supplier. She could not pay her 2 employees. She could not buy the medication stock that arrived every Thursday. The Argentine government had declared the corralito a banking restriction that froze nearly all domestic peso and dollar deposits. The official explanation was to stop capital flight. What it actually did was convert a banking crisis into a crisis for every ordinary person who had done everything right. 11 years of savings, technically present, practically gone. But here is the detail that gets lost in most accounts of that period. Not everyone was frozen. A small number of Argentine savers, not the very wealthy, not insiders, but ordinary professionals and business owners who had, in the months before the crisis, moved a portion of their savings into accounts at Uruguayan banks. Those people woke up in December 2001 with full access to their funds. The corralito was a decree of the Argentine government. Its reach stopped at the Argentine border. Accounts held in Montevideo were outside it. Completely, legally, simply outside it. This is not a story about predicting crises. Most of the people who had Uruguayan accounts had not predicted anything. They had simply diversified across jurisdictions, some for business reasons, some out of old-fashioned caution, some because they had family connections across the Rio de la Plata. The reason they moved the money barely matters. What matters is where it sat when the decree arrived. The surface reading of the Argentine crisis is, the banks failed. But that is not quite right. The banks did not fail in December 2001. They were closed by government instruction. The distinction sounds academic until you understand what it means practically. The government did not freeze assets it could not reach. It froze assets within its jurisdictional grasp. What sat outside that grasp remained liquid. That is the pattern that runs through every major financial restriction of the last 100 years. Not governments destroy wealth, but government decrees have edges, and those edges are where certain assets live. Go back further. Germany, 1933. When the National Socialist government began implementing currency controls and capital restrictions, one of the first mechanisms was the Reichsfluchtsteuer, the Reich flight tax, a levy of up to 25% on assets being moved abroad. The message was unmistakable. Keep your wealth inside Germany or pay a substantial exit cost. For many German citizens, the restrictions became progressively total. Bank accounts, domestic securities, business assets, all within reach. But gold held in Swiss bank accounts was a different matter. Foreign currency accounts in London were a different matter. Property held in France or the Netherlands through family trusts, for those who had established them before the restrictions, also a different matter. The decree could mandate what happened inside German borders. It could not mandate what happened in a Zurich vault. What historians record is that the families who maintained the most financial continuity through the 1930s were not necessarily the wealthiest before the crisis. They were the ones whose assets had the smallest overlap with the jurisdiction of the government issuing the restrictions. Their wealth was not better. It was harder to reach. This is where most people make the same intellectual mistake. They ask, what asset holds its value in a crisis? And that is a real question, but it is the second question. The first question, the one that determines whether the second question even becomes relevant, is what asset remains within your control when the system decides to reorganize itself? Those are not the same question. and conflating them is what leaves most people unprepared. If this pattern of jurisdictional reach is something you want to understand more deeply, how different countries have structured their asset protection frameworks and where the historical precedents diverge, that is exactly what we go into in the next video. Cyprus, 2013. The bail-in that restructured the Cypriot banking system over a single weekend was one of the most documented financial events of the last decade. Accounts above 100,000 euros at Laiki Bank lost an estimated 60% of their uninsured savings. Accounts at Bank of Cyprus above the threshold lost approximately 47.5%. These were not speculative holdings. These were operating accounts, business reserves, retirement savings. But walk around Nicosia in the months that followed, and you would find something that did not fit the narrative of total collapse. Small landlords who owned rental property outright, no mortgage, no bank encumbrance, continued collecting rent, in cash increasingly as trust in the banking system fell. Their asset had not been touched. Property registered in the owner's name, unencumbered, generated income that the bail-in mechanism had no instrument to capture. The bail-in was a banking sector restructuring. Its reach was the banking sector. The physical property outside the banking system, not pledged as collateral, not held through bank-administered vehicles, sat outside its reach. Not because the government chose to protect it, but because the mechanism had no lever to pull on it. The same logic applied to cash held outside the banking system, to gold coins stored at home, to assets held in foreign accounts that had not been repatriated into Cypriot banks. The decree's reach was real and severe within its domain. Outside that domain, ordinary commerce continued. Not easily, but it continued. Here is where the story becomes more complicated, because there is a category of asset that does not appear on any balance sheet, cannot be seized by any decree, and has shown up as a critical resource in every documented financial crisis without exception. It did not appear in the Cyprus bail-in. It did not appear in the German restrictions. It did not appear in the Argentine corralito. And yet, the historical record shows it operating in all three. Skills. Practical, specific, marketable human knowledge. The pharmacist in Cordoba, Graciela, eventually rebuilt, not through her frozen bank account, which took years to recover at heavily depreciated value. She rebuilt because she could still fill prescriptions. Her knowledge of medications, her relationships with suppliers in the parallel economy that emerged, her ability to provide a service people needed regardless of what currency they used to pay for it, none of that was frozen. The government decree had no instrument for confiscating competence. Historians studying economic recovery across multiple crisis periods have documented this consistently. The fastest rebuilders were rarely the ones who had preserved the most monetary wealth through the crisis. They were the ones who had preserved the most productive capacity. A doctor, a mechanic, a builder, a person who understood water systems or electrical infrastructure or agricultural production. In the immediate aftermath of currency disruption, the exchange value of applied knowledge is not set by any government. It is set by whoever needs it right now and has something to trade. Not all crises produce this dynamic equally. The 2013 Cyprus situation resolved within 2 years, with international support and restored banking access. Most Cypriots rebuilt within a normal time frame. The Argentine crisis of 2001 was more severe and more prolonged. The peso lost more than 70% of its value in the devaluation that followed, and the full recovery of frozen deposits took in some cases a decade. The German situation of the 1930s was categorically different. What began as financial restriction became something far darker. These crises are not interchangeable. They are points on a spectrum, not a single event type, but across all of them, a consistent structure appears. The assets that remained accessible, not just valuable, but accessible and controllable, shared specific characteristics. They sat outside the jurisdiction of the crisis government, or outside the banking system entirely, or outside any institutional intermediary that could be instructed to restrict access, or they existed inside the person themselves, in a form no decree has ever found a way to touch. The fourth asset category takes longer to see clearly because it does not look like an asset in the conventional sense. In the German context, it showed up as agricultural land. Farms outside the major urban centers, owned outright, producing food that had practical value regardless of what currency was being used or devalued. In Argentina in 2002, it showed up as rural properties whose owners bartered produce directly with neighboring farmers and local merchants, building exchange networks that operated entirely outside the frozen banking system. In post-war Europe, more broadly, it showed up as any productive piece of ground that could feed a family or generate tradable surplus. Productive land, held in a stable jurisdiction, unencumbered by debt, the reach of the decree rarely extended to its daily function. You could not always sell it freely during a crisis. Capital controls sometimes prevented the repatriation of sale proceeds, but it kept producing, and production, in a disrupted economy, is the closest thing to an unconditional asset that history has documented. Come back to Graciela's shop in Cordoba. December 2001. The statement showing her frozen 11 years of savings. She is standing at the window she cannot open. The question is not what she should have done differently to predict the corralito. Nobody predicted it with precision. The question is, what proportion of her savings sat within the reach of a single government's decree? The answer, for most Argentines in that moment, was almost all of it. Because almost all of it was in domestic accounts, denominated in domestic currency, held at domestic institutions, inside one jurisdiction. The pattern across 100 years of crises is not that governments always act this way, or that any particular crisis is inevitable, or that the financial system cannot be trusted. Most banking systems function for most people for most of their lives without incident. The pattern is simpler and more structural than that. Decrees have edges. Every financial restriction ever issued has had a jurisdictional boundary, an institutional boundary, or a definitional boundary, and the assets that sat at those edges remained accessible when the ones at the center did not. Here is the question the historical record keeps raising, and it is worth sitting with honestly. Of the assets you currently hold, what percentage sits entirely within the reach of a single government, a single institution, or a single system? Not because that system is about to fail, but because knowing the answer, clearly, without wishful thinking, is the starting point for everything else. That number tells you something. What you do with it is entirely your own decision.